Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language currently teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and as of fall 2017, moving to the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm back today with another video about a topic in Norse language and myth, and today I want to look at the names of the runes. I've done a video about this before, but I am remaking it because the previous video had somewhat poor audio and I had used a very light orange marker because it was all that I could find on the board, and that was pretty hard to read. So what I've done here is I've written out the Elder Futhark. This is the oldest stage of the runic alphabet that we know of. The earliest inscriptions in Elder Futhark that are known date to about 160 AD or CE. These come from Denmark. And the Elder Futhark continues to be used till about 700, at which point it is replaced in Scandinavia by the 16-letter Younger Futhark, and in England and Frisia by the expanded Anglo-Frisian Futhark. So starting from this point, there comes a system in Scandinavia that has fewer letters and a system in England and Frisia that uses more letters. The names of the runes are not actually attested at any point in Elder Futhark. We have to remember that there are actually fewer inscriptions in Elder Futhark than there are in Younger Futhark and Anglo-Frisian Futhark. This is a much earlier stage of the language. This is not the alphabet used to write Old Norse or Old English. The Old Norse language, the language of the Vikings, the sagas, the Eddas, is written in Younger Futhark. And so I think people overestimate just how much is actually preserved in Elder Futhark, and also try to over-apply it to languages like Old Norse and Old English. I have a video about how to write Old Norse and runes using Younger Futhark, which I'll link in a card in the top right corner. And since the names of these runes aren't preserved anywhere in Elder Futhark, we have to sort of try to figure them out, reconstruct them from the names that are preserved in the later runic alphabets. We know the names of the runes in Younger Futhark and Anglo-Frisian Futhark from the rune poems. There is an Old English rune poem, an Old Norwegian rune poem, and an Old Icelandic rune poem. Each of these poems uses a couple of lines for each rune that have a memorable image or a couple memorable images to help remember the name of the rune. So, for instance, in the Old Norwegian rune poem, a personal favorite of mine, the rune for M, which is called Mother in Old Norse, has this little ditty. Mother moldar auki, mikil greip og hauki. Mankind is mud given glory, a hawk holds strong. This is just to help remember the name of the rune by using alliterative lines of verse. So Mother moldar, M alliterating, and then M mikil greip og hauki. This is a pretty simple, basic form of Old Norse or Old English poetry, and it does make for fairly memorable lines. I have a translation of the Old Norwegian rune poem along with the Old Norse text that's available as a Patreon reward if you look at my Patreon page and you want to check that out. So these rune poems, which give us the names of the runes in Younger Futhark and Anglo-Frisian Futhark, are what we use to try to figure out what the names of the runes were in Elder Futhark. But Younger Futhark, as I pointed out, has 2/3 as many runes as Elder Futhark, so there are 8 runes that we have no information on the Norse names of. So a lot of the time we're actually reconstructing on the basis of almost only the Old English rune names. However, there is one additional source of information that is significant, which is the Gothic alphabet. The Gothic language is the earliest Germanic language available in large, cohesive texts from the 300s when the translation of the Bible by Bishop Wolfilas, or commissioned by Bishop Wolfilas, was made. The alphabet used to write Gothic at that time was based on the Greek alphabet, but the names of the letters in the alphabet were based on runes. Also, a couple of the letters in the alphabet are based on runes. We know the names of the Gothic alphabet thanks to an Old English writer named Alcuin, who recorded them as best he could. And so sometimes the Gothic names of the letters help us figure out what a rune name was in Elder Futhark 2. So on this board, what I've done is I've written out the 24 letters of Elder Futhark. There is a fair amount of variation between how these letters look, so I have used a pretty conservative or archaic form of most of these letters where there were a few different variants. Also, the way that the names are written out in the Roman alphabet will vary from scholar to scholar because people reconstruct Proto-Germanic with slight differences. You can also reconstruct a sort of earlier and a sort of later Proto-Germanic, a more Scandinavian-looking Proto-Germanic, a more English-looking Proto-Germanic. What I've tried to do here is just kind of keep a middle line. But the names that I use may look slightly different from what you've seen on websites or books. So to begin with, the rune that is equivalent in use to the letter F in English, stands for the sound F, is fehu. This is ancestral to the English word fee, as in something you pay for parking, and also to the German word fee, which means cattle. Most likely fehu in Proto-Germanic meant both, as does its descendant word fe in Old Norse. The letter for the sound u is urus. Most likely this originally meant the aurochs, an ancient European kind of wild cattle, but the later rune poems also point to possible meanings including storm and slag, as in bad iron. The rune for the th sound, as in thin or Thor or thunder, is thurisaz. Notice that this rune is borrowed in Old English and Old Norse, as well as by modern scholars for writing early Germanic languages, to stand for the th sound. So th in English, thin or Thor or theater, should not be written with a T rune and an H rune. It's written with just this rune for that th sound, so thurisaz. The letter is called thorn when it's used in the Roman alphabet. This is based on the Old English name, but the Elder Futhark name was more likely thurisaz, which means giant, which is based on the name in the Old Norse tradition. The rune for the letter A, the A sound, is Ansus. This is a god. This is the word that becomes Os in Old Norse, plural Asir, as in the family of gods that Odin, Thor, and Tyr belong to. Then there is the rune Raido for the sound R. This means a ride, which is much like what it sounds like. It is the ancestor of the English word ride. Then there is the rune Kauna for the K sound. This most likely has its Norse meaning of a blister or boil or sore, although the meaning suggested by the English rune poem, the torch, is also possible. Then there is the rune for the G sound. This is Gevo, which means gift, and the sound for the W or W sound. This is Unyo, which means joy. Then there is the H rune, which looks much like an H, but with a diagonal bar in the middle. This is Hagalaz, which means hail, as in an unpleasant form of precipitation. Then there's the N rune, now these. This means emergency, desperation, need. This is the origin of the English word need. Then there's Isaz. This means ice. This is ancestral to English ice. This is the rune for the letter I. This is the Y rune. This is the sound written with a J in most Germanic languages, although with a Y in English. The name of it, Yera, is ancestral to English year. But we should remember that this was more often used for the particular part of the year that the harvest came in, and especially of a good harvest, rather than for a rotation of the earth around the sun. So we might be better off translating this as harvest, even though it is ancestral to our word year. The next three runes, there's a lot of uncertainty about. We know that this rune stands for the P sound in Proto-Germanic, but P is very rare in early Germanic languages, so it doesn't appear very often. The testament of the Old English rune poem and the Gothic alphabet is confusing here. It does seem that the name contained an element per, which might be related to pear tree, but what its exact shape was is unknown. It might have been pertho or might have been perthro. It's very difficult to tell because there's been some corruption in the medieval evidence here. This rune, we're not even sure exactly what it meant. The best speculation I've read is that it meant the sound "a" in Proto-Germanic, so the sound of cat or bat, the vowel sound in those words. But based on the name of it in Old English, its name might have been Ethos, which doesn't contain that sound. Notice that all the other runes' names contain the sound of the rune. So this is a little odd and confusing. Ethos would mean the yew tree. And another curiosity here is that this name becomes the name of this rune when it's adapted into the younger Futhark in Scandinavia. So maybe this was actually the name of this rune. It's all pretty unclear, especially since this rune isn't even used in meaningful inscriptions outside of England. And in England, we find it used to mean a bunch of different vowels and even consonants. So very confusing testimony about this letter. This rune stands for the Z sound. Notice that this cannot come at the beginning of a word, so unlike the other rune names, the sound represented by the name comes at the end of the name. Algis means elk. This is ancestral to the English word elk, but since this is European English we're talking about, this is what Americans would call a moose. Then there is the rune for S. It has many different forms in Elder Futhark. This is just one, but its name was pretty clearly Soelo, meaning sun, as in the sky, sun. Then there's the T rune. This is named Tiwaz. This is the name of the god Tyr. It becomes Tyr in Old Norse. It becomes Tu in Old English, which is, of course, still with us in the form of Tuesday. Then there's the B rune, Berkana, which means birch tree. There's the rune for E, the S sound. This has a couple different forms, including one that looks more like an M. Its name was Ehwaz, which means horse. Then there's the M rune, which is named Manas, which means man, ancestral to English man. The L rune, named Lagus. Its name means lake. This also has sometimes been reconstructed as Laukas, which would mean onion, leek, garlic. Then there is the second rune that has a name that does not start with the sound that it represents. Ingwaz, because no word in Proto-Germanic or any Germanic language that I know of can start with the ng sound. This is the sound like in sing or ring or finger. The name Ingwaz is the earlier name of the god Frør, god of agriculture. Then there's the D rune. It's named Dagaz, which means day. And the O rune, which is named Othala, which means inherited property. Sometimes in Elder Futhark inscriptions you'll see the order of these two runes reversed, but the correct or original order seems to be with D and then O. I have another video on this channel that concerns the possible origin of the runes, looking at some of the ideas about that, as well as my own pet hypothesis about it, as well as some other videos about topics in runes and Old Norse language and Old Norse myth, including about my new translation of the Poetic Edda, the main source for the myths of the Norse gods and heroes. For now, I hope this has been somewhat useful and informative to you, and I'm wishing you all the best.